This is my version of a controversial title for a talk. So thanks to the organizers and everybody for having us here today. I'm going to, this is kind of more of a like, this is what Carson is thinking about right now set of slides. And it just so happens that it ties into our topic about open data today. So I'm going to go through and I'll try to link a few ideas back to what some of my panelists have talked about. And then I'll try and finish off maybe with some suggestions for possible discussion topics once we're finished. So, but before I do that, I'll tell you maybe why I should be here. Right? You always have to kind of justify your existence in academia. So that's what this slide is about. So I'll admit to being a former open source zealot. I used to sort of say if you're not using open source and open data, then you're not doing science. Because if it's not completely open, people can't reproduce what you're doing, right? And that's what science is. It's reproducible. It's here's what I did in order to answer this interesting question. And so, I used to sort of scoff at others who weren't doing things in an open way, and I've sort of changed my perspective over time. And so I'll talk a little bit about why my perspective has changed and some of the people and ideas that have influenced that, and hopefully tie that into this idea of openness. Okay. So, but why I'm here, I've worked on the QGIS open source GIS project since about 2007. So for those who are keeping track, that means I'm kind of like an open source hipster, right? I wasn't there at the beginning in the 90s when things were really taking off, but I got there kind of early before it was cool. So I would consider myself an open source hipster, particularly in terms of interacting with the QGIS project. And the coolest thing about the QGIS project now is that they don't need me anymore. So a lot of the things that I did at the time, developing a lot of the tools and things that went into it, I haven't touched in years, and they still exist and they still get used by millions actually of downloads now every month for new versions or for the latest version of QGIS. And my name is embedded in the code somewhere, so millions of times a month my name gets downloaded onto someone's computer, which is pretty cool. And in fact, that's actually one thing I did want to talk about in terms of openness and open source and open data, is it was probably the smartest move I made career-wise, because it actually provides an opportunity to interact with a lot larger community of researchers and individuals and things like that. And so I'll talk about this idea of open, not necessarily equating to access, but certainly at least promoting it. So now I work a lot on geospatial Python packages, do a lot of programming in that realm. That's all open source stuff. And then recently I've been involved in something called the EnviroCar data project. So this is a project where we collect environmental data from people's smartphones as they drive around. And it's like they volunteer to do this. We're not just sneaking on people. And the EnviroCar data is made available as open linked data. So that any researcher, planner, someone concerned with urban environmental issues can use the data. It's completely anonymized. And we address a lot, or we try to address a lot of the issues with open data. So I can talk a little bit about that as well as we get sort of further along. But as I said, I was a former open source zealot, and this is probably what sort of spawned that initial sort of reaction to not being open. So during my PhD, I was writing a paper and I wanted to make it, real science, and I wanted to tell people, what sort of a classification system I was using for breaking up my data into different classes. And so I went online, as you do, and tried to Google for, the algorithm that was being used in the software that I was using at the time. And since I guess we're not allowed to say their name today, it's on the screen there, so you can figure it out. So I wanted to figure out what it was. So I looked and I found this forum post, does ArcMap use the Jenks-Caspel or the Fisher-Jenks algorithm for classifying data into natural breaks? Seems like a pretty reasonable question and potentially quite important, given that these two versions of the algorithm produce different results. And so the response was, and there were some helpful responses and, sort of, yeah, we'd like to help you, but that's proprietary information along the lines of a trade secret, and so our policy is that we don't share that. So that was very frustrating because now I'm going to try and produce some research and I can't actually tell anybody for sure how I'm actually producing that research. And so I felt like this is not real science. This is something. So I decided, as a sort of someone who's a bit of a nerd, I decided, well, I'll just code up this algorithm myself using open source software. And hey, that's great, and everybody should do that. Except that not everybody wants to do that. And so there's this sort of tension here, right? That I decided it was very important for me to do that, so I did it, and I published a paper, and I could tell you exactly what algorithm was used to do the classification. But this isn't an issue, or isn't a possibility for a lot of people. And so that's another issue of openness I'd like to talk a little bit about today. And so that's kind of that, and some discussions actually at an AAG workshop not that long ago, a year or two ago, about OpenGIS, started getting me to admit that maybe there are some, it's not this sort of yes or no open kind of question. There is a continuum of openness. And so this picture here is supposed to suggest that over time, along the road of my career, I discovered maybe there's actually a sort of continuum of openness, right? Not everybody has to be able to write their own algorithms in order to be open, in order to be doing some aspect of open science, open GIS, using open data. So it's this continuum, and I kind of want to talk about that today as a potential discussion topic. And I'm not the only person who thinks about these kinds of ideas. There are lots of lots of others talking about this idea of openness, and I'm talking specifically about sort of the openness of products, or openness of GIS, openness of data, openness of collaboration. There's a lot of different ways that we can talk about this, but in the literature, people like to have letters that repeat. Alliteration is always really great if you can do that, because it can drive your point home a little bit better. Comedians use it a lot as well. And so we've got this sort of big, the 4 V's of big data, and we've got the 4 R's of openness. And so if you really want to make an impact, you need alliteration. But basically, the idea is that in order for something to be open, a resource, be it software, data, communication tool, a communication system, it should be freely available to others to reuse in different contexts. That's kind of like the baseline requirement for something to be open. All right? Even communication, right? You need to be able to freely exchange ideas to others, and they need to be able to use those ideas in other contexts to make points. Right? If I'm having a conversation with someone, then I need to be able to do these things just as much as if I'm going to be using a piece of software to answer a question. All right? So the 3 R's, like recycling, are to be able to reuse, revise, remix, and redistribute things. Okay? So this is this idea of the three R's of openness. All right? So if we're talking about software, I should be able to reuse that software. I should be able to make some changes to it. I should be able to combine that software with something else, and then I should be able to share it with other people in order so that they can see what I'm thinking about. And one of the coolest things about the sort of proliferation of GIS technologies over the last few years has been this idea of remixing different geospatial data sources, right? And a lot of web mapping technologies have really facilitated this. It started with sort of hacking together bits and pieces of Google Maps in order to show houses for sale on a web map, and now it's gotten to the point where we have a lot of different web mapping technologies, a bunch of different data. People can mash things together to answer some interesting questions. And one of the other issues I'd like to talk about today, if we have time, is this idea that this is probably just a really great thing, right? There are all of these open data sources and open data sets, or open data or open source software components out there, and it means that a lot more people are playing around with these things. And most of them, probably 99% of them, are not formally trained spatial citizens. And so they're producing pretty weird stuff sometimes. Density maps that aren't actually mapping density and all sorts of things. And at a recent AAG conference, there were some people who said, well, maybe we should take a step back and say, no, let's not let all these people make these maps because they're doing it wrong. And I thought that was a super scary thought, right? This whole idea of openness is that if we have 1,000 really bad maps and 1 good one, that's much better than a couple of good ones and nothing else, as far as I'm concerned. So the idea that the ability to reuse, revise, remix, and redistribute things in ways that maybe aren't the smartest still produce useful results. And it allows citizens who are not trained, as Laxmi was talking about, citizens who are maybe not as trained as professionals, they can still make an impact or potentially make an impact. So that's another thing I'd like to talk about. But one of the kind of interesting things I've seen since being really angry during my PhD that I couldn't get at this code to now is that we really have seen a change in the openness landscape in terms of software, in terms of data, and definitely in terms of attitudes. So it used to be that I have a colleague at Esri, and I've had many discussions with them. You know, oh yeah, open source software is great, and his sort of come back to that was like, well, you know, prove it. Why is it better? Why is it better than a proprietary system? You have to be able to justify that in order to say it's better. And my reaction to that is, no, I don't think so, actually. We as a society value transparency and openness. We clearly do, otherwise we wouldn't be promoting open data access, and transparent government and things like that. So there is actually no need to justify this idea of openness and access to things. It's a thing that we value as a society. So it doesn't need to meet the same criteria as a proprietary software company as a business model. It's just a good idea, right? So, and I think that we've seen that sort of attitude change quite a bit. In fact, I have a number here. Numbers are good. 78% of companies now run on some form of open source software. So this is from somewhere in their sort of software stack or in their everyday business model. 78%. There's a source at the bottom if you don't believe me. 78% of companies run open source software, and 65% of Americans over the last year have used online open data portals to access information about their government, right? Which is, 65%. That's quite a lot. That's people who are interested in accessing information in order to learn something about their government. I should mention that only 5% of those people think that their access is sufficient to this type of information. Okay, so lots of people want to do it, but most people don't think it's good enough to do it. And so that brings me to an important idea, which is structural issues of openness. So even if we make something available online as a PDF, right, it doesn't mean that we actually have access to it. And many of the people who we want to have access to this information don't have a degree in computer science in order to parse a CSV file and make a map and view it online in the first place. And there are a bunch of communities, particularly in New York, like this meetup group called Beta NYC, who have lowered the barrier for so many data sets in the city to the point where most people can actually interact with some data. And that's fantastic. But that's something that I think, and Laxmi was talking about this as well, that's something I think that we really need to address now as people interested in open data, is now the data is out there and that's great, right? And now we have the software that everybody can mix and match together, but not everybody has access to the skills and ideas required. So access to these open products is not uniform by any stretch of the imagination. I can grab some source code and modify it to look at some particular geospatial algorithm, but my mom can't do that. And I'd still like her to be as informed about what's going on in her community as I am if I want to be, right? So here are a few discussion points that we could touch on that I've kind of touched on a little bit in my class. And you'll notice that I have used a visual style based on the least open communication medium possible, which is an iPhone. So there you go, some little bit of irony for you in the afternoon. Thank you very much.